חברות וחברים, גבירותיי ורבותיי, ערב טוב. רציתי לדבר על הקשר האישי שבין פיטר גפן לאברהם יהושע השל מנקודת מבטי, אבל את זה אני משאיר לך לדבר. אני רק אציג בפניכם את היושב ראש של הרב שיח, וגם אנחנו נראה סרט, לפני זה נקשיב גם להשל עצמו קצת, מדברים כל הזמן עליו, אז כדאי שנשמע אותו. ואני אומר לכם שבין המון דברים שיש לי מה לומר על פיטר, הוא המייסד של השל סקול בניו יורק, מוסד לתפארת, שכדאי ללמוד עליו, כדאי ללמוד על כל התהליך החינוכי הזה. ובין הרבה מאוד דברים אחרים, הוא ייסד לאחרונה ארגון שנקרא כיוונים, שאני רק על זה, אני חושב שאנחנו צריכים לעשות כנס של 3 ימים על הפרויקטים המרתקים ועל החשיבה כל כך שונה מבחינה חינוכית, על כל כך, הייתי אומר, אולי בהשראתו של השל מקדימה את זמנה וכולי. אז זה מקצת שבחו של אדם בפניו, ואני מעביר את רשות הדיבור לפיטר. בבקשה.
That's why I came from New York to get an introduction like that. So, I'm Reverend Richard Fernandez will speak on Heschel and his leadership in the religious opposition to the war in Vietnam. And Dick, we wish you and all of our other Christian friends here at the conference a Merry Christmas. We're getting very close. Dick is a minister in the United Church of Christ, and for the past 50 years has been involved in a variety of interfaith organizations focused on peace, civil rights, and other public policy issues. During the Vietnam War, he was director of a national peace organization, clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam. Rabbi Heschel was one of the founders of this organization, and Heschel served as one of the co-chairs of its board. It was during this time that Dick and Heschel became very close. Rabbi Mauricio Balter will speak on the influence of Heschel on Rabbi Marshall Meyer and Meyer's opposition to the brutal junta during those terrible years in Argentina. Rabbi Balter is a Rav Kehilati in Beersheba. He is the co-president of the Rabbinical Assembly of America of Israel of Conservative Judaism, and he is an active member of Rabbis for Human Rights. He received his rabbinical semicha from the Rabbi Marshall Meyer Seminario Rabbinico in Latin America. Ruth Gavison is the Chaim H. Cohen Professor Emerita of Human Rights at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She holds an LLB, LLM, and BA degree Philosophy and Economics from the Hebrew University and a Doctor of Philosophy in Legal Philosophy from Oxford. Ruth has received numerous awards and honors, including the 2011 Israel Prize. She is a former chairperson and president of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and the founding president of Mitzilah, a center for Zionist, Jewish, liberal, and humanist thought. She recently submitted to the Minister of Justice recommendations concerning constitutional enrichment of Israel's vision as a Jewish and democratic state. Dick, you're up.
I wept during that film. I could have been sitting there rather than Frank Ruddles. That's the conversation I used to have with the rabbi. I wept. It is Christmas Eve for us, and after this, thanks to the organizers, Shira and others, we get to go out to Bethlehem, and with 18,000 other people, I guess. It is not an easy matter for me to speak of Rabbi Heschel, and there are 3 reasons for this. First, I'm not a Heschel scholar. Although I used part of a study leave 15 years ago to read about 8 of his books, I did not do what I should have done, take time and go back and say, what did I learn from all of these? You can call that the sin of a community organizer, but I didn't take that time. I was impacted by them in a number of different ways, but not in some strong analytical way. The second reason this is difficult for me is that even though Rabbi Heschel and I developed a really close relationship during the Vietnam War, We were very busy trying to stop a war. It never once occurred to me to take notes, like I might write a book or be invited to Jerusalem to talk about it. Didn't occur to me one time. I think that's a good thing, but I wish I'd taken some notes. I learned more about our relationship in some ways by a young man who did a book on our organization, reminding me of a lot of things that took place between us. I also remember calling the house, and I get this little girl on the phone, and she's here today. That's terrific. Really wonderful. People grow up, I notice. The third reason this is a little difficult is obvious. I'm not dumb, and I am pious, but in contrast to that man, I'm a wimp. I have never in my lifetime, before or since, met a more pious person. Until I met him, that was not a good word to me. He made piety for me a very rich and wonderful word. He carried his piety in such a beautiful, warm, affectionate way for many, many people. Even when he gets mad, he's still this pious person. And I will always feel enriched by that. I did not know Rabbi Heschel until I did not meet him until 1966, but I knew of him right before then. When I was a seminary student, we were all aware of his work with the Vatican Council. It hurt him back a couple of thousand years of anti-Semitism, which was no mean task. It had been tried before and failed. He had some helpers, I know, but he was a pivotal factor in those discussions. And I've never seen a book written on the politics of all that, but I'm sure there's one out there. I also knew of him because he was involved in civil rights, and specifically I was aware when I was a seminary student of his appearance out in Chicago at a huge conference. It was called a Religion and Race Conference in 1960, let me get the right, 3. There were 700 clergy there from all over the country. The mood was very pessimistic. It didn't seem as if the movement was gaining ground. Does that sound familiar? And just before he spoke, a friend of his, Bill Stringfellow, a lawyer, stood up and gave this most pessimistic analysis of what was happening. And Bill, who is white, ended with a comment like this: "And when the riots come and a black man has a knife against your stomach, do not plead with him and say, 'Let me tell you what I did for you a few weeks ago.'" Very pessimistic. The place exploded in applause, just to give you some sense of the level of frustration of people there. Heschel was the next speaker, and he came to the podium, and he turned and looked at Bill. He said, "Bill, if my relatives had that pessimistic view, I'd still be crushing stone back in Egypt." I don't really know what he said for a speech, but as a seminary student, I was stunned that anybody would say something like that out loud in front of such a big group of people to someone who is a friend. I learned later he did that on more than one occasion. I met Rabbi Heschel for the first time in 1966. I was a candidate for a job that didn't actually exist. They were looking for the first director of clergy and laity concerned. I had an interview. They asked me a bunch of questions. I was interviewed by people who in seminary, I read all their books. I read Heschel's Prophets, McAfee Brown, Daniel Berrigan, Dr. John Bennett. It was kind of a who's who of people I didn't even know. What saved me was my today, and they hired me. I only remember 2 things about Heschel. First, he looked like he fell out of a Cecil B. DeMille production of The Prophets. The barbers of New York must have sued him many times over. He obviously never had his hair cut, and I don't think anybody ever combed it very often. But the other thing I remember was, here I am, we're going to try to stop the war, I'm supposed to build an organization. All these questions you could ask me. He asked me one question. The prophet asked me, "Tell us about your family." I was tongue-tied. I was all set for anything but that. So I don't know what I said. I must have said something about my wife and 3 children, but I can't even remember what I said. So I came home, and my wife, who had majored in biblical history, said to me, "Well, how'd it go?" And I said, "Well, it went pretty good, I think. But I have to tell you, Heschel, this rabbi, he asked me a question about you and the boys, and we both kind of chuckled. Later on, I learned that for nothing is unimportant and everything is to be appreciated. And I found that out over the next 7-8 years in 100 different ways. It wasn't an idle question. It wasn't a throwaway. It just toppled me. I was in another wave when he asked that question. Let me move back now just briefly to the creation of Clergy and Laity Concern in 1965. There were early protests. The media was all over them. James Reston in the New York Times said they're postponing peace. The J. Edgar Hoover said they were morally corrupt. It went on and on. So Heschel and a group of New York clergy got together to do two things. First, protect these protesters' First Amendment rights and say they had a right to protest, but then themselves to say they were against this war in Vietnam, wherever that was for most Americans. And as the press conference was winding down, someone said to Heschel or to the group, "Are you all going to continue?" The group, having never discussed it, was surprised to hear Heschel said, "Well, of course, never discussed." About 2 months later, after several meetings, they decided to form the organization of clergy, and originally called clergy. Then they decided there were lay people out in the congregations, and so they called it Clergy and Laity Concerned. My first job was to build an organization. That meant a lot of travel around the country. I had a stationery with 35 or 40 names down the side of prominent religious leaders. It opened doors for me, so I went to Los Angeles or San Diego or Austin, Texas. People would get a group together, would talk about what they could do. The stunning part for me was no matter where I went, and it only happened with rabbis, the rabbi afterward would come up and say, "Remember me to Rabbi Heschel. I was a student of Heschel's." One rabbi handed me a note. "Would you bring this to Rabbi Heschel?" All over the country. Conservative, Reformed. Nobody else did that for the other clergy. The Protestants never got no one ever said, "Did you know McAfee Brown?" or anybody. So he had some credit out there around the country. One of the nice things about my job at Clergy and Laity, my office was 6 blocks away from Heschel's, and he on occasion would call and say, "Could you come and see me?" And I usually did it that day. It was just 6 blocks up. You walk into the crowded office. You couldn't, it was all books. Every shelf was covered with paper and books. It was arranged in a way in which he could find his way around and nobody else. And this one afternoon we were talking about how terrible things were, that nobody in the White House or in Congress seemed to figure out how to compromise with the Vietnamese and get a peace settlement. Sound familiar? I guess that goes on all the time. And in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of a sentence, Heschel says, "Wait a minute." He goes up to his book stacks and pulls off a book by Reinhold Niebuhr, and he reads this quote, "We should be far less concerned with the purity of our actions and much more concerned with the integrity of our compromises." You notice I didn't look at a note. I've repeated it 1,000 times in my lifetime since. For you all, you should know that this is Reinhold Niebuhr, who was one of the great stalwarts of wanting the state of Israel to exist. And he went all over the country talking about it. Now remember that quote, because here's the next one. Niebuhr said, "I understand that some people are going to see this as an act of imperialism, but it's an act we must take." That's what the quote means. That's what the quote means. And I only learned that many years later. It's a compromise. Hello, compromise. Heschel, of course, said after he read the quote, he sat down and he says, "Well, what we should do with this is we should frame it and send it to every member of Congress." We didn't do that. The most difficult and heartfelt conversation we ever had, among many, was after the 6-day war. And he came back and called me about 2 or 3 weeks later, and would I come and see him? And I said yes. And I'm going to read this because it's I think it's very important. We spent over an hour talking about his time in in Israel. Perhaps it's better to say I listened to an intense and both pride-filled and sorrowful man. He could not find enough words to describe his pride in the soldiers that defended Israel in that moment, reporting on a number of first-person conversations, and a couple of times he teared up talking about that. Then he said, at the same time, he wondered with equal passion again and again, when will the conflict ever end? He expressed great anxiety about the future and particularly possible violence. He knew deep down in the marrow of his bones that when there is violence and bloodshed, to quote him, God cries, God says, woe to me. God is very unhappy when man is unhappy. It was the morning of in February 1968 with Coretta Scott King, Bill Coffin, 2 or 3 others and myself, a group of 6 of us went in to see Secretary Kissinger. We were the peace people. Kissinger had been in Washington about a month. We spent 45 minutes with him. He said in many different ways, several times over, he was new to Washington, how difficult it is to deal with all these different parts of the government. He needs time. He repeated that 3 or 4 different ways. As we were about ready to leave, Heschel had not said a word. And then he looks at Kissinger in a very soft voice, and he says, where is it? Oh, wait just a minute. And he says, Mr. Kissinger, you have said that it is complicated here in Washington and that you are new and it takes time. Today, as we sit here, the people in Vietnam are dying. Mr. Kissinger, you should try harder. The room felt really quiet. We stood, shook hands, and departed. What did I learn? If you have something to say that is very hard for someone else to hear, say it simply, directly, and with a very soft voice. One of the most delightful parts of knowing Rabbi Heschel was the fact that for all of his seriousness as a scholar and as an activist, he was in many ways a gentle and caring person. I do not remember a time when we were together where he didn't ask about my wife and my 3 boys by name. Always by name. He'd never say, how are your kids? John, David, and Richard. So there's two stories about Susie, now called Susanna, that I'd like to share, because I think it says something else about the rabbi. So in the Heschel household, it was the rabbi who used to take Susie and a young woman named Annette Miller downtown shopping when they were young. Trying on clothes. That's what the rabbis do, right? So here's Heschel. Can you imagine this guy you just saw here, right? He's sitting on a stool in the department store watching 2 girls try on clothes. Not that they were going to buy them. They were just trying them and giving his opinion. Okay? I don't know what school he went to for that, but he seemed to enjoy it. The other one is when Susie was young, some of the girls she used to hang out with loved rock bands and Susie didn't. And they were thinking they were going to go hear a guy named, what's his name? Sonny and the Pacers. Jerry. I actually looked it up. Sonny and the Pacers. Jerry? Hello, I got rock people out there? Very, okay. Well, that makes 2 of us. Neither one of us into it. And the deal was, so she wanted to do something to cover herself without going to the rock band. And so she called the hotel and tried to get into Jerry's phone system, and the operator cut her off. So she did what any girl would do, young girl. She told her father. And the father did what any good rabbi would do. He called the hotel. And being a good rabbi, he got a meeting with Jerry the next afternoon, and with one of her girlfriends and the 2 moms, they went down and got the autograph. Okay? Now, I think that's a great story about a person this impressive and this important. I don't know what you think. I just love it. But it was the war that did not let him go. It's already been mentioned that at the seminary there was some negative feedback. You all know that he also got feedback from what I would call a larger Jewish community that was probably fearful that if he got involved and stayed involved and was public, it might have impact on what happens in Congress with regard to funds for Israel. Always that fear. And so even though that stuff was out there, it never seemed to deter him. I got a call in the summer of 1967 from a friend out in Los Angeles, a colleague, and there was a Marine by the name of Frank Robertson who was brought up on charges as a Marine for not wanting to go to Vietnam. My friend, who was head of our clergy chapter out there, said they wanted some religious leader to come and speak. And I was trying to think, who do I know on the West Coast that might be around? And then I remembered Heschel's there this summer, and I tracked him down, got a phone number, and I called my friend back, and I said, just call him here. He's in Los Angeles, and tell him what you want. My friend said, well, but Dick, you know him better than I do. You call him, you have more success. I said, you don't understand. He's very upset about the war. If he is free, he will come. And the next Sunday at Camp Pendleton, Heschel said about this young man, you have no idea. Outside the camp, here's what he said. He says, the government should give this guy an award. They should be praising him as a great example of moral courage rather than putting him in jail. So he never backed down. He was always available. He taught seminar, I'm told, too. But he was always available for Vietnam stuff. I was walking up Broadway in New York one time, and I saw Heschel ahead of me go across the street and into Union Seminary. I assumed to teach a course. I had never heard a lecture. I thought, well, I can spare an hour. I followed him at a distance, went to the second floor. He went in the first floor to the classroom. I walked in the back door, sat down quickly. He didn't see me. And I'm all ready for a lecture. I saw one of the students had a book on the prophets. I thought, I'm going to hear a lecture on the prophets. Heschel comes in like a very typical faculty person, didn't even look up at the class, looking down at his books and his paper. And he begins with this. How can we talk about God when we are killing his children all over Southeast Asia? How can we study the Old Testament with all the prophets screaming at us to do more and to show our outrage? He didn't begin every class like that, I'm sure, and I stayed for the rest of the lecture. But I thought, does this stuff never let him go? Is it always with him all day, every day? It appeared to me that it was so. One of the most difficult decisions we ever made a clergy lady concerned was when Seymour Melman, a professor at Columbia University, came to our board and said he thinks we should be doing a study on war crimes. During recent times in the newspapers, there were things reported that would allow you to believe that American servicemen were doing things that were criminal in terms of international law. We had a 2-hour discussion about the possibility of doing this. A couple of board members weren't quite sure, and it was clear that Heschel was not sure. Melman picked that up and he said, why don't we table the meeting and can we talk about it a month from now? We all agreed. During that time, Melman met with Heschel on a couple of occasions. He never told me exactly what happened. He said at one point that Heschel was concerned, among other things, that if the study was not done very carefully, it could really throw a big backlash at us in the larger anti-war movement. The board came back together in a month, and in a very short conversation, people agreed to move ahead. And 15 months later, we produced a book called In the Name of America, signed by 30 religious leaders. It was front page on the New York Times, all over, in other papers all over the country. We had a press conference down at the UN. There probably were 20 press, but there must have been 15 or 20 religious leaders there supporting Heschel and others who were speaking. So the press got through talking, and then it was the religious leaders' turn to ask questions. And I'm a Protestant. I don't know everything about Jews. I'm sorry. So when Maurice Eisendrath and Arthur Lelyveld, who were at that time 2 of the big rabbis in the country, they wanted to ask Heschel a question. And the first thing they said was, Rabbi Heschel, may I ask you a question? And Heschel would just kind of nod yes and ask a question. I had never seen that kind of respect publicly in my lifetime. And certainly at our board meetings, no one ever asked permission to say something to him. But here were these 2 big-time rabbis. Lelyveld coming all the way in from Cleveland. So that's another learning for from me, the respect that he had in a wide circle of people. So what moved into all this activity? I can talk a little bit if you want to later on about the Riverside Church stuff, but it's a complicated matter, so I didn't get into it. So what moved it? What moved him into civil rights and the peace movement? What got him away from the lectern? What began to cut away at his study time and his creative writing? And he gives several reasons, and Ed Kaplan got into it. But the one that he cites as the most important was when he was writing the book on the prophets. And he became convicted, or I guess that's the right word, he became convicted. I'm aware that other things had gone on in his life. And I never think, I think social change and how any of us change is very complicated, and there's usually a lot of factors. So I was immediately suspicious when he said the prophets were the big thing. And so in preparing this speech, I found one of these quotes out of that 1938 speech. And if Rabbi Heschel were here today, and this still makes it easy for me to do this. I mean, he was right there a moment ago, so just pretend he's still sitting there. If he were here, I would say this to him. You have said that the study and the writing about the prophets moved you to become engaged in civil rights and protest the war in Vietnam. I observe that your prophetic voice began much earlier. In 1935 in Frankfurt, Germany, at the age of 32, you gave an address before a group of Quaker leaders. It is one of the most remarkable speeches I have ever read. I told a friend it looked like it fell out of the book of Jeremiah. I think your own words may have contributed to your own intellectual and moral fiber in ways that you may not have realized. It's worth reading a very small portion of that speech called The Meaning of This Hour. And I quote, "The horrors of our time fill our I'm reading this not because it was written in 1938, because it could be written today. The horrors of our time fill our souls with reproach and everlasting shame. We have profaned the word of God, and we have been given the wealth of our land, the ingenuity of our minds, and the dear lives of our youth to tragedy and perdition. There has never been more reason for man to be ashamed than now. Silence hovers mercifully over the dreadful lands. The day of the Lord is the day without the Lord. Why dost thou not halt the train loaded with Jews being led to slaughter? It is so hard to raise a child, to nourish and to educate them. Why dost thou make it so easy to kill? Like Moses, we hide our face." I would then say to Heschel, my dear friend, this is how he addressed me often, my dear friend, is it not better to say that the prophets had been at work inside of you for a very long time, and that writing the book was the tipping point that prompted your personal engagement in these issues? And I think the good rabbi would have, for a moment, stopped and thought about my question, and then, with a knowing smile, responded, perhaps. Perhaps. About risk, the risks he took. Heschel knew full well what happens when good people are afraid to risk, fall silent in the face of evil. For Heschel, the only risk was silence. I have frequently been asked if Rabbi Heschel were alive today, what might he be saying or doing? And I say in jest, of course, he might not be saying too much or doing too much. He'd be over 100, right? But leave that aside. I think if he were alive today, there are some things he would be interested in. He'd be at odds with the government of both the United States and Israel, as only a lover of both nations could be, because of their violence and oppression. He'd be furious with the shooting of unarmed people of color in my country, and disappointing to the point of despair over the unlawful land grab for more and more settlements here. He would be engaged in a much wider, as Ed Kaplan said, interreligious discussion. I think he'd be particularly interested in talking to Muslims out of a Sufi orientation. And finally, I think he'd be curious whether to know in the academic communities of both nations, if there are teachers and scholars who will find, as he found, that being silent in the face of violence at so many levels is a pathway to perdition. Thankfully, Heschel broke his silence and became engaged in issues of his time because he understood the words of my old friend Michael Walzer. We still believe, or many of us do, what the Exodus first taught, or what it has been commonly taken to teach about the meaning and possibility of politics and its proper form. First, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get there except by joining hands and marching. Thank you.